The wind swept across the open plains, carrying with it the mingled scents of sagebrush and dust, the very breath of the western frontier. In the late summer light, the small town of Willow Creek seemed caught between two worlds, the rough lawlessness of the untamed land and the fragile civility its townsfolk struggled to build. Wooden storefronts lined the single street, their paint already weathered by harsh winters, while the steeple of a modest church rose above it all, a symbol of hope more than grandeur. Men tied their horses outside the saloon, women hurried along the boardwalks with baskets of flour or bolts of cloth, and children darted through the dust, their laughter threading through the steady hum of daily work. For John Carter, the town was nothing more than a place to pass through when necessary. He was not a man given to idle chatter or community affairs. At 37, the lines around his eyes were cut deeper than his age should allow, carved there by years of long labor under the sun and an ache that refused to leave him. His ranch lay miles beyond Willow Creek, a spread of rolling land hemmed in by mountains on one side and the wide sky on the other. The land yielded cattle and hay enough to sustain him, but no laughter echoed in his house, no soft voice broke the silence of evenings. He had once dreamed of more. Years ago, his young wife had died giving birth to their first child. The infant, too, had been lost, or so he believed. The twin blow had left John hollow. He buried his grief beneath work and solitude, convincing himself that he needed nothing more than the soil beneath his boots and the rhythm of ranch life. A man could live without tenderness, he told himself, so long as his hands remained busy. But life in Willow Creek was not untouched by gossip, and that gossip soon entangled him in the fate of Mary Thompson. Mary was the town's schoolteacher, a woman of 25 whose gentle manner belied the strength within her. She had come west after losing her parents to illness, determined to build a life where her talents were needed. Her classroom was small, a single-room building at the edge of town, yet her voice carried warmth that kept even the most restless children attentive. She read stories with such conviction that young eyes widened in wonder, and when she set her chalk aside, she listened with the patience of someone who valued every question, no matter how small. Yet kindness did not shield her from hardship. With no family and little savings, Mary was considered vulnerable. More than once, she had caught the eye of men in town, but one suitor had grown particularly insistent, Charles Dunning, the banker's son. Charles possessed wealth and influence, and with them, a sense of entitlement. His advances toward Mary were not gentle. He spoke of her future as if it were his to dictate, of the security he would grant her if she accepted his proposal. When she refused him, his pride burned, and soon whispers spread that she was foolish, ungrateful, perhaps even compromised. Mary endured the rumors with as much grace as she could muster, but she felt the walls closing in. In a town where a woman's reputation could be the difference between survival and ruin, her independence became fragile ground. It was at the church social one sweltering evening that John noticed her distress. She stood near the back, offering polite smiles to the matrons who questioned her choices, but her hands twisted the hem of her dress with quiet desperation. Charles Dunning hovered nearby, his smug expression announcing his victory over her dignity. Something in Mary's eyes, something wounded yet defiant, pulled at John in a way he hadn't expected. Later that night, he found her alone, gathering the last of the hymnals after the congregation had gone. The lamplight caught the copper tones in her hair and the resolute line of her jaw. She looked up, startled, as he approached. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You don't look well." Her attempt at a smile faltered. "I'm fine, Mr. Carter. Just a long day." He studied her for a moment. Silence came easily to John, but now it felt inadequate. "Folks talk," he said at last. "And talk can do damage." Mary's eyes lowered. "I know." Something stirred in him then, something beyond pity, an echo of the man he had once been, who believed in protecting what was good. Words rose in his throat before he had fully considered them. "A woman deserves better than whispers," he said. "She deserves a name that shields her. If you'll have it, I'll give you mine." Her head snapped up, shock and confusion warring on her face. "Mr. Carter, are Are you asking me to marry you? He held her gaze, steady and unflinching. I am. Not for love, not yet. But for your safety. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. You'll have my home, my name, and my protection. The silence stretched long. Mary's heart pounded in her chest. She had never dreamed of marrying without affection, but what choice did she have? Alone, she was prey to men like Charles and the judgment of society. With John, she saw no cruelty, only an austere honesty that demanded respect. Her voice trembled, but her eyes met his squarely. If you're certain, then yes. The next morning, Willow Creek buzzed with the news. The quiet rancher and the schoolteacher had wed in a small ceremony at the church, with only a handful of witnesses. Charles Dunning's jaw tightened with fury, and gossip redoubled, but Mary stood taller, her chin lifted with a dignity newly fortified by the Carter name. Their first ride out to John's ranch was marked by silence, save for the steady clop of hooves on the dirt road. Mary's hands clutched the reins of her borrowed horse, her thoughts a storm of uncertainty. She had chosen survival, but what did survival look like with a man who barely spoke, who seemed carved from stone? John, for his part, stole glances at her. She sat the saddle with surprising grace, her spine straight, her eyes scanning the horizon as if memorizing every ridge and valley. He felt the faintest stirrings of something he had long buried, an awareness of companionship, however fragile. When they reached the ranch house, Mary dismounted and stood before the sprawling land that was now her home. The mountains loomed in the distance, and the wind rustled through the tall grass like a whisper of things to come. She turned to John, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her heart. "Well, Mr. Carter," she said, "it seems this is where our story begins." For the first time in years, John allowed himself the smallest smile. "Yes, Mrs. Carter," he replied. "It does." And with that, the arrangement was sealed, an arrangement born not of affection, but of necessity. Yet beneath its surface, something unspoken lingered, waiting to grow. The first days of marriage passed in a quiet rhythm, more practical than romantic. For Mary, life at the Carter Ranch was a world apart from the schoolhouse and the gentle routines she had known in town. Here, dawn came with the crow of the rooster, and the land demanded effort with no allowance for hesitation. The ranch house itself was sturdy but plain, built of weathered timber that bore the mark of John's hands. Its rooms were sparse, functional rather than welcoming. A kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a dining table scarred by years of use, and a parlor that had known little laughter in recent memory. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms stood opposite each other, his and now hers. Though married, they did not share a bed. Their union had been forged from necessity, and John seemed intent on preserving a respectful distance. Mary did not protest. She had entered this arrangement with open eyes, yet still, in the quiet hours of night, she sometimes wondered if she had traded one kind of loneliness for another. Her days quickly filled with tasks unfamiliar to her. At dawn, John showed her how to gather eggs from the chicken coop, warning her about the temperamental rooster. She startled the first time a hen flapped against her arm, dropping the basket and scattering shells across the dirt. John said nothing, merely stooped to help her collect what remained. But later, when she set the cracked eggs aside for baking rather than wasting them, he gave a brief nod of approval. Cooking, too, presented challenges. Accustomed to smaller meals in town, she found herself battling with heavy cast-iron pans and learning to stretch simple ingredients to feed ranch hands who came by to work cattle. Her first attempt at stew was too thin, and John, though polite, could not hide the faint wince as he tasted it. The next day, she studied one of his mother's old recipe books, its pages yellowed and smudged, and tried again. This time the broth was hearty, and when John cleared his bowl without comment, she felt a flicker of pride. Slowly, patterns formed. John rose before dawn, his boots echoing through the wooden halls, and returned at dusk with dust on his clothes and weariness etched into his posture. Mary kept the house, tended a small garden, and rode into town twice a week to continue teaching. The children greeted her eagerly, though she noticed how townsfolk's whispers softened now that she bore John's name. Some even looked at her with newfound respect, as though her worth had been validated by marriage. Yet despite this fragile stability, a gulf remained between husband and wife. John was courteous but reserved, his words measured, his eyes often distant. Mary longed to pierce that silence, to know what thoughts lingered behind his guarded expression. At times she caught him watching her with an intensity that startled her, but when she met his gaze, he would turn away, retreating into himself. It was not until one evening, when a storm rolled over the plains, that a small crack appeared in the wall between them. The wind howled around the house, rattling shutters and sending rain lashing against the windows. Mary sat by the fire, mending one of John's shirts where the sleeve had torn. The rhythm of needle and thread calmed her, though each strike of thunder made her flinch. John entered from the barn, his coat soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead. Without a word, he hung his hat and set his boots by the door. "You'll catch your death out there," Mary said softly, startled by her own boldness. He glanced at her, then at the shirt in her lap. His brow furrowed. "You don't need to do that. I've managed well enough on my own." She tied off the thread, refusing to be dismissed. "Perhaps. But managing isn't the same as living." For a long moment, only the fire crackled between them. Then, unexpectedly, John sat in the chair opposite her, stretching his long legs toward the hearth. His face softened, shadows dancing across his features. "You remind me of her," he said finally, voice low. Mary's hands stilled on the fabric. "Your wife." He nodded. "Anna. She had the same stubborn streak, always trying to mend what was broken." His gaze dropped to the fire, and a silence heavy with memory filled the room. Mary hesitated, torn between sympathy and fear of overstepping. "I'm not here to replace her," she said gently. "I couldn't, but I would like to share this life with you, in whatever way you'll allow." John's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening in the flickering light. He gave no reply, yet he did not rise to leave. For Mary, that silence was not rejection but a fragile thread of trust, as though he had allowed her, if only briefly, to glimpse the pain he carried. The days that followed built upon that moment in small, unspoken ways. John began leaving small tasks undone, as though inviting her participation, stacking firewood but letting her arrange it, mending fences but asking her to hold the nails. At meals, his comments grew less perfunctory. "This stew has good flavor," he said one night, and though the words were simple, Mary heard the sincerity beneath them. When she rode into town, John sometimes accompanied her, walking beside her into the schoolhouse. The children whispered and giggled at the sight, but Mary noticed the way John's eyes softened when he watched her teach. Once, she caught him crouched outside the window, listening as she read aloud a story, his expression caught between longing and wonder. Still, barriers remained. At night, he retreated to his own room, and Mary lay awake in hers, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering if companionship would ever blossom into affection. She did not crave grand passion, only the comfort of belonging. Yet she sensed that John's heart was a locked door, its key buried deep in the grief he could not release. The turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while tidying the upstairs rooms, Mary opened a drawer in John's bureau and found a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Curiosity overcame her, and she unfolded it to reveal a baby's blanket, delicately embroidered with the name Samuel. Her breath caught. She traced the stitching with trembling fingers, realizing this was a relic of the child John had lost. She quickly refolded the bundle and returned it to its place, but the knowledge weighed heavily on her. That evening, as they shared a meal in silence, she longed to speak of it, to offer comfort, but the words stuck in her throat. She feared that if she revealed what she had seen, he would retreat again into the fortress of his sorrow. Instead, she watched him across the table, the furrow of his brow, the weariness in his eyes, and resolved that she would not abandon him to loneliness. Whatever time it took, however much patience was required, she would wait for him to let her in. That night, Another storm gathered on the horizon. As lightning split the sky and rain hammered the roof, Mary lit a lantern and carried it downstairs. She found John already at the hearth, staring into the flames. Without a word, she placed the lantern beside him and sat down. Their shoulders brushed, a fleeting contact that sent warmth through the chill air. Neither spoke, yet in that quiet, something shifted. For the first time, John did not pull away, and Mary, sitting beside him with the storm raging beyond the walls, felt a fragile but undeniable sense of belonging, like the first seeds of trust taking root in rocky soil. The weeks slid into autumn, the air sharpening with the promise of winter. Mary had begun to feel a rhythm on the ranch, her hands roughened by work yet her heart steadied by the quiet companionship that grew between her and John. They were not lovers, not yet, but each day brought a subtle easing of distance. Trust, though fragile, was sprouting like green shoots in early spring. It was on one of her schoolhouse days that fate struck without warning. A traveling missionary wagon rolled into Willow Creek, its sides painted with faded scripture and its benches crowded with children. Orphans, the preacher explained, gathered from towns ravaged by illness or misfortune, now being carried westward in search of families who might take them in. The townsfolk gathered with cautious curiosity, some offering food, others looking away, unwilling to shoulder another mouth to feed. Mary's pupils pressed to the windows, whispering excitedly, and she stepped outside to greet the newcomers. Her gaze swept across the children, thin shoulders, patched clothes, wary eyes that spoke of hunger deeper than the stomach. One boy, however, caught her breath. He could not have been more than 7. His hair was the same dark brown as the soil after rain, his eyes startlingly blue, wide with both fear and stubborn courage. Around his neck hung a small locket on a leather cord, its brass worn but intact. Something about that locket tugged at Mary with peculiar urgency. She drew nearer, kneeling so her eyes met his. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Samuel," he replied, his voice cautious but steady. The name struck her like a bell, echoing against the memory of the embroidered blanket hidden in John's drawer. Her heart faltered. She forced a calm smile, though her mind reeled. "That's a strong name," she said softly. "Do you know where you came from, Samuel?" He shrugged. "They say my mama died when I was a baby. I don't remember her. I lived with some people for a while, but they sent me here. I don't know why." His small fingers closed protectively over the locket. "This is all I have. Mama gave it to me." Mary's throat tightened. She had never seen John wear jewelry, but she remembered how carefully he kept that blanket, how deeply the name Samuel had seemed carved into his heart. She reached out, brushing a thumb gently over the locket. It bore a tiny engraving, "To Samuel, with love." Her chest constricted. She had to be certain before she spoke. That evening, when John returned from the pastures, Mary waited by the fire, the boy's name burning on her lips. She set aside her mending as he stepped through the door. His face was lined with weariness, but the moment he saw her expression, he paused, sensing something had shifted. "There's something you must see," she said, her voice low but steady. Suspicion flickered across his face. "What is it?" "Tomorrow. At the schoolhouse. Please, John, trust me." He said nothing more, yet the weight of his gaze lingered as though he had glimpsed her urgency and felt its pull. The next day, John rode with her into town, his silence sharper than any blade. When they reached the schoolyard, Mary guided him toward the group of orphans gathered with the preacher. The moment Samuel lifted his eyes and met John's, time seemed to shatter. John froze. His breath caught audibly, chest rising and falling in ragged bursts. The boy's face, his nose, his jaw, the tilt of his chin, was a mirror of John's own features etched onto a younger canvas. Mary touched his arm lightly. "His name is Samuel," she whispered. The word struck like a hammer. John staggered, his eyes fixed on the locket that gleamed against the boy's chest. His hand rose, trembling, then fell uselessly at his side. The preacher noticed their stillness. "Do you know the boy, sir?" John's mouth worked soundlessly before words scraped free. He was mine." Mary's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. She knelt before Samuel again, her tone tender. "Samuel, this is Mr. Carter. Do you know the name Carter?" The boy frowned, shaking his head. "No. I remember a house once. Not like this town. Wide fields. Horses." He hesitated, eyes flicking between them. "It feels like a dream, though." John dropped to one knee, his calloused hands trembling as they reached toward the child, stopping just short of touching. "You were taken," he whispered. "They told me you were gone. That neither of you survived." His voice cracked, raw with years of grief. The preacher shifted uneasily. "The boy was left with relatives after his mother's passing. I suppose they thought it best to take him east. But life there must have turned hard, and he was placed with us." John's eyes filled with tears, glistening in the harsh daylight. He looked at Mary, lost, as if he were a man stripped of all defenses. She laid a hand over his, grounding him. "He's here now," she murmured. "That's what matters." The boy studied them both with quiet suspicion and used to tenderness. "Are you saying you're my pa?" John swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, Samuel. I am. And I swear, by heaven and earth, I'll never lose you again." The words hung in the air like a vow sanctified by more than time. In the days that followed, Samuel came to the ranch, uncertain at first, but gradually easing into the rhythm of his new surroundings. He marveled at the horses, shyly followed Mary as she gardened, and sat stiffly at the supper table, as though unsure how to belong. John hovered, torn between awe and fear, as though one wrong move might shatter this fragile miracle. Mary became the bridge. She coaxed Samuel to eat, taught him small chores, and read to him by lamplight. At first, the boy gravitated toward her, perhaps sensing her gentleness as safer ground. John watched with aching longing, his hands curling into fists at his sides, until one evening Samuel crept closer to him, tugged at his sleeve, and asked, "Will you show me how to ride?" For John, the request was salvation. His voice thick, he lifted the boy onto a gentle mare and walked beside them as twilight bathed the land in gold. The boy's laughter rang out, clear, unguarded, a sound John thought he would never hear from his own flesh and blood. Later, after Samuel had fallen asleep in a borrowed bed, John sat by the hearth with Mary. His hands covered his face, and for the first time since she had known him, he wept openly. "You gave him back to me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You gave me my son." Mary's heart swelled with fierce tenderness. She laid her hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "No, John. He was always yours. I only helped you see it." In that moment, she understood. Their marriage, born of necessity, had become the doorway to something greater than either had imagined. They were no longer two souls bound by convenience. They were three lives, father, mother, and child, tentatively weaving together into family. And though the threads were fragile, they glowed with the promise of love reborn from the ashes of grief. The days that followed Samuel's arrival at the ranch brimmed with wonder and unease, as though life had shifted beneath John's feet, and he was learning to walk again on unfamiliar ground. The boy filled the once empty rooms with sounds John had not heard in years. Curious questions, quick laughter, the shuffle of small feet. Yet with joy came the gnawing ache of guilt. Each time he looked into Samuel's eyes, so like his own, John felt the weight of failure. He should have searched harder. He should never have believed the word of in-laws who told him the child was gone. He should have fought. Instead, he had surrendered to despair, burying himself in solitude and silence. Now Samuel was here, a living testament to both providence and John's own weakness, and John feared the boy would one day see him as unworthy. Mary sensed his torment long before he voiced it. She found him one evening in the barn, staring at the mare Samuel had ridden, his shoulders hunched with the heaviness of thought. "You'll wear a hole in the floor if you keep pacing," she said gently, her presence breaking the shadows. He turned toward her, face hard but eyes raw. "He deserves a better man. A father who didn't stop believing." Mary stepped closer, her hands steady though her heart raced. He deserves the man who kneels beside him when he falls, who teaches him how to hold the reins, who looks at him like he's a miracle. Samuel doesn't need the father you wish you'd been. He needs the father you are now. Her words sank into him like water on parched soil. For a moment, he could not speak, only reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers with surprising tenderness. It was the first time he had sought her touch without hesitation. But the world beyond the ranch was not so quick to accept this newfound family. Rumors, once muted, swelled again in Willow Creek. Charles Dunning, spurned and bitter, spread whispers that Samuel was no true heir, that Mary had contrived the boy's appearance to secure her position. Some listened. Others watched with curiosity. Mary bore the scrutiny with lifted chin, though inside, she feared the corrosive power of gossip might unravel all they were building. John, however, stood firm. When Charles confronted him outside the general store, sneering that Mary was nothing more than a schemer, John's temper, long restrained, snapped. His fist landed squarely, dropping Charles to the dust. The town gasped, but John's voice rang clear, steady as iron. That woman is my wife, and that boy is my blood. Speak against them again, and you'll answer to me. The statement carried further than any rumor. From that day, folks spoke more cautiously, and some even softened toward Mary, admiring her patience and devotion. Yet inside the ranch house, the greatest battles were quieter ones, fought in the silence of nights, when uncertainty pressed heavily against fragile hope. Mary's bond with Samuel deepened swiftly. She tucked him into bed with gentle prayers, taught him letters by the firelight, and soothed his fears when nightmares came. The boy, hungry for motherly affection, soon looked to her instinctively. Still, the first time he called her Mama, it was by accident, a slip of the tongue as she tied his boots. He flushed, embarrassed, but she smiled through tears and kissed his brow. Later that evening, she told John, her voice trembling with joy. He called me Mama. John's eyes shone in the lamplight. He reached out, cupping her cheek with rough tenderness. Because that's what you are to him. You've given him what I couldn't. She placed her hand over his.
No, John.
We've given him what he needed, together. The word together lingered in the air, warm and fragile. John's chest tightened with feelings he had long buried, feelings that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the woman before him. For months he had kept his heart locked, convinced love was a luxury denied him. Yet Mary had slipped past every barrier, not with grand gestures, but with quiet constancy, the kind of courage that healed without demand. One night, unable to hold back any longer, he found her in the parlor, reading by lamplight. He stood in the doorway, uncertain, then crossed the room with deliberate steps. Mary, he said, his voice roughened by emotion. She looked up, and he sank to one knee beside her chair. I married you to protect you. I told myself it was duty, nothing more. But I was blind. You've been more than a wife. You've been a light in the darkest part of my life. You gave me back my son, and you gave me back myself. I love you, Mary Carter. With all that I am. Her book slipped from her lap, forgotten. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling freely as she cupped his face in her hands. John, I never asked for love, only kindness. But what you've given me is more than I ever dared hope for. I love you too. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a sealing of promises made not at the altar but here, in the fragile rebuilding of two broken hearts. When Samuel stirred from sleep and padded into the room, rubbing his eyes, he found them together, hand in hand. He climbed onto Mary's lap and leaned against John's shoulder, fitting there as though he had always belonged. Are we a real family now? He asked sleepily. John pressed a kiss to his son's hair, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, son. We are. For as long as God grants us breath. Mary wrapped her arms around them both, the fire crackling warmly at their side. In that circle of embrace, the wounds of the past softened, replaced by the promise of a future shaped not by duty, but by love freely chosen. Outside, The prairie wind carried its endless song across the darkened land, a reminder that life was harsh, uncertain, and often unforgiving. Yet within the walls of the Carter Ranch, hope had taken root. Not the fragile hope of convenience or survival, but the enduring kind that bound hearts together through sacrifice, faith, and devotion. Moral: love is not always born of passion's spark. Sometimes it grows quietly from acts of sacrifice and trust, until one day it reveals itself as the strongest force of all. In the vast, untamed West, where life was fleeting and tomorrow never guaranteed, family was not only blood, but the courage to choose each other, again and again.